later in the queue.
That
We
sounds
can
great.
move on
Thank you.
to Freddie. Freddie, if you are prepared. Perfect. And this is Freddy Martinez, Policy Analyst at Open the Government on Foia and reform efforts. Thank you, Freddie.
Thank you, Ginger. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Foia is an extremely important tool for the public to access records of the executive branch. It's led to Pulitzer Prize winning investigations. It's exposed waste, fraud, and abuse by administrations of every political leaning. And it is really one of the most important laws that the public has to know to describe it how the Supreme Court said, to know what the government is up to. And Foia is being used more and more by the public. Hundreds of thousands of requests, nearing almost 1 million a year. And the growing use of Foia means that while the public is more aware of its importance than ever, it also means that the growth is showing real strains and real faults with the law so far. And I'll talk very briefly about some of those faults. The first one is redaction. So the government is allowed to exempt information that under a series of categories that are supposed to be narrowly construed, but Foia has sort of internal attention in its design. There are agency interests to protect, which exemptions are supposed to do, versus the public's interest to and the public's right to know. And we find overwhelmingly that when we come into this tension, agencies will just abuse exemptions, use them unnecessarily, and there is very little recourse for the public to challenge exemptions. The other big problem, as Walter alluded to, is delays. Sometimes it will take years or decades to get records back. In fact, right now, people are waiting longer than ever to even initiate litigation to get FOIA records back. So even when you can litigate over a FOIA request, people are even waiting even longer than ever in that scenario. When people do sue agencies to get records, it is not uncommon for a judge to order a production schedule of 500 pages a month. That doesn't mean you get 500 pages a month. It means that agency officials will review 500 pages a month and will make a determination on those records. So it's not uncommon to file a lawsuit, and then every month, sometimes you'll get no records or duplicate records or records that are completely redacted. Litigation in the FOIA space has exploded in the last 10 years. And the primary reason is that often it's the fastest way to get records, but it's also the costliest for both requesters and agencies. These cases can drag on for years because, as I said, agencies are only sometimes required to review 500 pages a month, which is really what they should have been doing in the first place, which is basically they're processing FOIA requests as they should have been doing the entire time. But now you have a lawyer looking over their back, and it slows everything down and just makes everything far more costlier. And there are limitations with litigation as well. When people challenge the use of exemptions, judges side with agencies over 90% of the time. And the basic premise of judicial review means that judges are really deciding is what kind of information is exempt, not actually what is presumed to be open to the public, right? Because the very nature of these cases is, does this exemption apply in this scenario or not? And over time, we just keep seeing that volume of what is exempt, as decided by judges, just keeps growing and growing and growing. So what can we do? First of all, we need champions on the Hill for transparency. When there are, these massive infrastructure bills, NDAA, Build Back Better, we need people to really take a look at how does this touch transparency? How does this touch FOIA? So that's like the one takeaway that I recommend people take from today. Like, we need champions on transparency, especially with FOIA. We need reforms that maximize proactive disclosure. Things like the calendar agency heads are routinely requested, and there's no reason that FOIA statute can't just dictate that those be proactively disclosed. We need improvement to agency budgets through appropriations. So, for example, this appropriation cycle, dedicated a small bump to interior to reduce their FOIA backlog, and the same amount last year helped reduce their backlog by 5%. So these kinds of things can be done through appropriations, and we have seen some success in that. We also need to strengthen judicial review. We need to let judges know that they can do and order far more than just 500 pages a month. They can order agencies to do additional searches, sit for depositions, all sorts of things that they really don't want to do right now. Reforms could also include the use of a public interest balancing test, right? Right now, exemptions only say it does. Right now with exemptions, there's basically one or two tests. Does the exemption apply or not? And that's basically all judges can decide, which basically means that if a record is, let's say a hypothetical here related to the president's, decisions on 1/6, basically all the judge could ever decide is there an executive branch privilege, yes or no? But obviously there's a huge public interest in these kinds of records that we just can't consider. So we need some kind of public interest balancing test. Finally, Congress could mandate expanded electronic access to records. So FOIA officials right now are not required to have direct access to the electronic records that they would ultimately search, read, redact, and release. And Congress could just dictate that. And I think that's what I have. Thanks, Ginger. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, a lot of those reforms are things that are very dear to our hearts here at Demand Progress, especially as someone who's previously worked on FOIA in a federal agency. FOIA officers and anyone working on processing FOIA requests really needs to have access to the documents themselves instead of relying on some subject matter expert to respond to their emails and give them the relevant documents. So I think that would be a particularly meaningful reform. And we are going to